All right. So again, these are just more general and applies across different teams, such as work groups and the like. So it can be applied not only to treatment groups, but if you're ever working in a group or will be in charge of some group, this presentation applies to all of those. Okay. So the basic definition of a group is two or more individuals that come into personal or meaningful contact on a continuous basis. Okay. Now, there's a difference between groups and teams, which helps us provide a little bit more depth and understanding about what a group is. Okay. And that they're not the same. Teams are more of a subset of groups. So, for example, a team, you might have a group assignment for one of your groups, usually a psychoeducational group of some type, and you may divide them into different subsets, and that would be considered a team because a team is usually a temporary um, um, set of individuals that have a little bit more structure and a little and are goal driven. So again, it's kind of like if you think about, I know they use the term group assignments, but when they do assignments in college, that's more of teams because it's going to be temporary, it's going to be very well structured, and it's going to have goals. Okay. Now, many treatment groups do have structure and goals, but they're not as organized. They go with the flow of the group and where the group is achieving as it moves along. So let's talk a little bit about group size and group tasks, some of the functions, dynamic effects of how groups and team function. So normally groups are small, between 2 to 9 members. Small groups interact better and tend to be more motivated. Now, I will tell you for treatment groups, very specifically, the ultimate size is between 6 to 9. Okay. If you get below six, you don't get a lot of processing. Individuals feel like they're being targeted more often, and the like. If you get above 9, then you run the risk of excluding group members. You run the risk of it not of too many perspectives, and I know this sounds bad, but too many perspectives to where the group moves at a more sluggish pace, and it becomes more like a class instead of a group. Okay. As this suggests, use large groups when more resources are needed. Okay. Group tasks impact how the group interacts. So when we talk about interdependence, shows how work of one member impacts another. And this is important for our area of work because we want interdependence. Okay. We want each group member to have some type of positive influence on each of the other group members. This also starts to complicate things because each of your group members also becomes closer and closer and closer. And this is where, as a group facilitators up front, you need to make sure you make roles, or we'll talk about group rules. And a few of the rules is you know making sure that intimate and personal relationships are separate from the group and the group process. Um, And there's also, especially when you start getting larger and larger groups, you get the risk of what's called social loafing. You all know one of these doing group projects at college or in high school, where there's always one or two individuals that are just kind of there in the group, floating by, letting everyone else do all the work, and then they just maybe at the last moment they add just enough to be included in the group project, and this is a form of social loafing. Okay. Um, and some ways to reduce this. Now, social loafing in the treatment group process usually happens when an individual just really does not want to be there. So these tend to be forced individuals into the group because of probation or parole, or because family is, saying we're going to cut you off if you don't go. And they just really don't want to be there. And there's some ways that you can reduce that social loafing and to try to get them into quote unquote the flow. The first one is make individuals' contributions identifiable. So later on, we're going to talk about thinking check-ins or check-ins. Usually with a good therapy group, when the group comes in, you do a check-in. And then when at the end of the group to kind of say, what have you learned today? What have you experienced? You do a check out. In the check-in, you make sure everybody provides something that happens. And as the facilitator, you thank each of the individuals and you try to state something that they mentioned in their check-in. So that you just don't say, thank you, Bob. Great check-in. No, you say, thank you, Bob. And then you note something that Bob said and say that was really good for you to share, or that's interesting, and we'll pick up on that later in the group or something like that. But you make that personal contribution important. You emphasize the value of individual contributions, and this is done up front in the beginning of the group and when the group is forming. You continually, at the beginning of the group, especially for the first 5 to 6 sessions, you always kind of emphasize this notion, hey, we're here together, we're in this together, and we need to work together. Okay. And of course, this one is something that should be under your control, is that keep the group size to an appropriate level. So that 6 to 9 is the ultimate level, because it makes it so no one can hide in the background. Okay. But again, I mentioned 6 to 9 because once you get under that, you get individuals who are not willing to share as well because they feel, because of the smallness of that group, they don't feel, quite as much about being in that broader group that you're working with. So, okay. By the way, these things also do work in if you're doing group projects in school and stuff. These things have been shown to also help out. I'm not going to say, see the word reduce. I'm not going to say it's going to eliminate it, but if you keep these things in mind, it does help with group projects in school. So when we're talking about interdependence, we're talking about 3 basic types. Actually, I think there's more than 3. Is pooled task interdependence. This is when members make separate independent contributions to a group. This is more of that stereotypical kind of group project we do in college, especially online, where you meet in the beginning and everyone says, okay, I'm going to do the introduction. Another person says, I'll investigate this part, I'll investigate this part. And then there's the member who says, I'll put it all together and write the conclusion. This is kind of a pulled task type of independence. And the performance isn't based on necessarily the content or anything, it's based on the sum of the members' contributions. Now, in the therapy world, this is not used very often. You usually don't have this. You might see it in like a psychoeducational type group, where you're having them do a task and each of them has to bring a component. When we think about children's groups, you might do this with the parents, where you ask one parent to next time bring Play-Doh and another parent to bring paper, art supplies, whatever it may be, to kind of make it so that the group runs efficiently. But with adults group, you don't see the pooled task interdependence very much, except for maybe a few psychosocial groups. And I'm trying to remember, can someone put in the chat and remind me whether I differentiated between a therapeutic group, a process group, and a psychoeducational group before I go on, because I know I'm using those terms. Anyone remember? Because I don't. No. Okay, thank you. All right. All right. So when I refer to a therapeutic group, okay, we're usually talking about a group of individuals who have the same diagnosis or substance use. And we're using a therapeutic process to help them work through their symptoms. Okay. So this is usually they're run by master or bachelor level individuals. And they have a very specific aim in that it's not about education, it's about the alleviation of symptoms. Okay. When I talk about a process group, this is a lot of times used with cancer survivors, some trauma survivors. Usually it's an acute type of survivor type group. Um, and this is where individuals are coming together and conversations are just facilitated and the individuals are just processing the information. Okay. And then a psychoeducational group, usually used, I can think of domestic violence survivors and domestic violent offender groups tend to be psychoeducational. A few PTSD type groups, especially non-combat PTSD groups, tend to be on a psychoeducational level. They're often used as a precursor to a therapeutic group or to a process group. So, for example, a lot of times in the domestic violence field, you'll have individuals go through the psychoeducational group, and then they can go into a process group, which lasts, longer than you can continually go to that process group. Okay. Now, a psychoeducational group is where if you want to think about it, it's kind of a combination of teaching and group process, where you have very specific topics. So, the power, for example, in the domestic violence field, you have the power and control wheel. So the facilitator will go through and educate about each of the power and control strategies. And then you might have, so has anyone experienced these? And then you'll ask, how did you experience those? So it's much more of a directed type of group. So if we want to think of it as levels of difficulty, the therapeutic group is usually the more difficult one, usually requires more training and education. Then process groups are kind of in that middle, and then psychoeducational are the ones that they still need quite a bit of expertise and stuff, but there's usually a set curriculum. It's more educational and less processing and therapeutic based. So when I'm using those terms, that's what I mean by those. When we get to pooled task, we may use those in a psycho educational group, but maybe not necessarily a process group or a therapeutic group. Sequential tasks of independence members perform tasks in a sequential order. So this is another good example of psychoeducational is you go through modules basically. I can think of there's a PTSD group that works really well with women who have experienced multiple traumas through their life, and it's called Seeking Safety. And it's very modular based that you go through one section before you move on to the next. And performance really isn't measured in essence, but through the worksheets and everything that you have the clients do, you note whether they're progressing or not. Okay. And so that's a sequential type of group section. Reciprocal task interdependence is work is performed by members and a dependent on work by others. Work performed by a member is dependent upon work by another member. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading this sentence for some reason. So this is a good example of more of a process group, and let me kind of explain this. So you have one individual, and let's say you have them do a check-in and or a theme. You have someone address a theme such as let me think. Um, having a hard time thinking today. A theme such as um, how your intimate relationship influences your substance use. Okay. And you have one person start the conversation, or you may even start the conversation, and then you have each group member build on that. So one person's experience, then they look into that experience and they either relate to it or not relate to it, and then they add something to it, and you kind of roll with that throughout the members of the group. So that's what we call reciprocal, is one person's performance then goes into another person's performance, and they're providing feedback really to each other. Okay. And this is done a lot in all three of those types of groups, in the therapeutic, process, and psychoeducational. This technique is very utilized in those cases. Whoops. I want to see group. Okay, so what I'd like to do is go through how groups develop and how they perform over time based on where they are in the development phase. And we'll go over these. So the basic trajectory is a forming, getting together, storming, this kind of get to know each other, norming, figuring out what it is we need to be doing. Performing is then going through the steps of performing those tasks, and then adjourning is when really the group has come to a stagnation point. And I'll provide a visual of this in here in just a minute. And we know that groups move through these stages, and you can stop at a stage and spend a lot of time there, and you can move back in a stage where you kind of have to do a reset. But the progression tends to be the same regardless of the group. And it is true that the faster they move through the process, the better. So especially when we're talking about therapeutic groups and psychoeducational groups, which has kind of a set curriculum. But for example, research has shown that the more compact a group is, the more effective it is at treating. So, for example, a lot of groups for PTSD, trauma, therapeutic groups is what I'm referring to. Depression groups, anxiety groups, therapeutic groups tend to be very effective when it's about 16 to 24 sessions. But once you get above that 24 sessions, those groups tend to be less and less efficient. Okay. All right. So this is the kind of what we were talking about. So here we have degree of maturity. Okay, maturity referring to the group members are working together. You all have found your common goal, your common place, and we're ready to go. Okay, and then of course here at this we have time to end. Okay, and so this is when we are forming the group. Okay, so we'll start with this. Groups are brought together. An orientation of some type occurs. Become aware of friendships and task objects. So usually when you go into the group, you're going to find your people those people you prefer to sit by. And the amount of information and commitment and acceptance of the goals is important in this phase. So in this forming phase is when you set the rules for the group, you get commitment to those rules, you get commitments to the curriculum, if you want to call it that, and to becoming better. And so in this forming, you're really developing the goals and the process and the kind of rules for the group. Um, People are recognizing each other and developing friendships, and you'll notice that just like a classroom and a group, people come in and usually sit in the same place that they sit, just like in a class. And anxiety about the group and the task and performance capability tend to be high during these stages. And I think this is understandable why you're entering this group with usually a bunch of strangers. You're still hesitant about whether you want this modality of treatment and whether it's going to be effective. And then you're worrying, what other people are thinking about you. So that's really kind of normal. The important thing as the facilitator to develop during this period is what we call efficacy belief. Okay. Self-efficacy is the uh, amount of knowledge and amount of awareness about how you can complete a task. So for example, if you have high self-efficacy in your school performance, that you can do it, you can get it done, you'll usually get a higher grade. If you're hesitant about your academic performance, you'll tend to not have such an efficacy. Okay. And during this phase, the facilitator plays a crucial role in making it so the group participants really believe in themselves and believe in the group, that they can have positive outcomes and that they can do well. Okay, so that's the norming phase. So this is where we're at in this phase, and you can note degree of maturity is, if you want to think about maturity as the group's ability to work together in a constructive way. And you can see that it's pretty low in the forming phase. And then we're going to go, once we kind of have this cohesiveness, we've all agreed to the rules and we know each other. This is when we go into the storming phase. So let's take a look at that. I don't like how that has to do that. In the storming phase, this is often called the conflict stage. And yes, conflict occurs in therapeutic process and psychoeducational group. It's hard to avoid, but this is where competitive or strained behaviors emerge over conflict about roles and objectives. Okay. This is where, if you remember earlier in the class, I mentioned how there can be there's going to be emergent leaders and emergent followers. And this is really where you're going to see those who are probably not going to be healthy leaders start to dominate the group, start to telling other group members that they can't, they should do it their way. And this is where, during a group, uh, Jill and Bill go to the corner and start spreading rumors, or start talking nastily about John and Harry, and about what they said and how ridiculous they are, because they're trying to form a clique within the group. Um, this then leads to frustration and anger. And this is where, and we'll spend some time on this is where we will talk about conflict resolution, okay? Because some conflict is beneficial. Some conflicts help us move. In plenty of groups, some of the group members needed just something just very blunt said uh, in the group to another individual, that individual is getting frustrated because the other group member is just not getting it or anything else. And so they just need to make that blunt statement. Okay. And so conflict can be beneficial. It can be a source of growth, But when it leads to frustration and anger, this is where conflict resolution skills as a facilitator play an important role. And I think we'll spend about a week or two just focusing on conflict resolution and what do you do with, quote unquote, the difficult client or the difficult clients in the group uh, situation. So again, we'll go back. I need to turn off these things so it does this one slide. You'll notice that storming, though, is leading to maturation. I don't know how many have taught have done Psych 101 or the Human Growth and Development class, but a famous psychologist, Jean Piaget, says that we grow through conflict. And he was talking about early childhood where we should be exposing our children to conflict and the parent's job is to provide the safe boundaries for which to experience it. This analogy can be made with the group process. We want our clients to experience conflict because that can lead to growth, but our job is to provide that safe space and that safe boundaries for that to occur. Because what's going to happen is those conflicts, they work through, they're resolved, it's going to result in what we call the norming phase of the group. And you'll notice there's a little bit more distance between the norming and performance and the other two. You'll notice there's just a little bit more distance. So let's look at the norming aspect of a group. This is where members start to begin to feel positive about the group. They take on a group identity of their own. They start to feel we are in this together. Roles tend to be pretty well established, and rules and norms are set and enforced by the members instead of the facilitator. So usually at the beginning of the group, you kind of give the rules, you ask the group if they want to include any other rules. And then for this first while, especially through the storming phase, it's usually the facilitator who is the enforcer of those rules. But when we get to the norming phase, group members should start holding themselves accountable. And this is when you know you're in the norming phase of the group, is when group members start saying, hey, we agreed not to, this is a stupid one. We agreed not to have food at group. Okay. That something as simple as that, if that's a rule that the group establishes. So some things that you will notice during this phase is some behavioral norms. So they'll start doing informal rules of behavior. So sometimes they'll even establish an order of who does check-ins and checks outs, even though there's no formal rule on that. And they're going to be widely shared and enforced by the group. And what they're really trying to do in this phase is facilitate what's called group survival, okay? Meaning that we're in this together, and so we want to make the group consistent. So this is predictability of behaviors, prevents embarrassing situation, and expresses important behaviors. So this is kind of where the group wants to head. And then when we get to And this is talking about organizational groups, but I will tell you, if you, on a behavioral level, it's really good when the group members start to utilize humor, not in a defensive way, not in a way that inhibits them from their use of humor to avoid a topic, but humor about the group as a whole. I always like it when, um, I always have a habit, even in the group say, to always use the word K. You get that K, and I've always had students and in groups say, I sound like the school counselor on in South Park because he has that same inflection, I guess. But anyways, and I always know that my class or everything we're connecting when we start using humor like that. So okay. So I want to finish just these statements about norming development. And so again, this is talking more organizational in this one, explicit statements by top management. In the group process, this is where you're actually able to, as a facilitator, to make explicit observations about what you've been observing in the group and how it's running. Okay. Um, Critical events precedence. So really again another good group thing is when let's say one of the group members checked in and they had a really awful thing happen to them in the last week, and the group and not the facilitator facilitate further conversation about that. So the group itself does not want to move on until they've had a good conversation about that group member's experiences. Recency is that, again, this is the idea that you want the last group to influence the individual's experiences over the next week until you meet again. Okay. What you want to look for is that individuals stop using their past experiences, their past negative behaviors, to guide them from one group to the next. Okay. You want them to utilize the skills that are being developed in that current group to get through the next group without any of their negative behaviors staying with them. So you're getting to the norming phase where members say, I used the skill from last group to overcome this triggering event that I had. So, stuff like that. Okay. So again, I want to go back to here, to here. Okay. So as you could probably tell, you have a very cohesive group. They're talking about each other's behaviors and their own. They've created a commitment to the goals of the group. They've created um, both explicit and non-explicit goals or rules that the group follows. Um, you're no longer having the group members fight for power and authority in the group. This is when you get to the performing phase. Okay. The thing that we need to be aware of in the performing phase is that you'll notice adjourning is going to start here. Okay. Where the group's maturity is already on the decline. Okay. In the performing phase, what you do is you hope that the group members start utilizing the skills that they're learning and the coping skills that they're learning in the group. They've reduced, for example, in a substance abuse group, reduced their triggering behaviors, or they're coping with triggering behaviors in a healthier way. When we talk about a trauma-based group, they're having less triggers to smells or things associated with trauma, and they're not defining themselves as the trauma. This is something that's important if you're doing trauma groups, is usually when a person comes into a trauma group, they define themselves completely based on that trauma, that everything in their life has happened to them because of the trauma that they experienced. And what you hope to start hearing in the performing phase is that trauma was just one part of my life's experience that informed me something about myself, but does not define me. And once you get them talking like that, you know that you're going through the performing phase. They're really integrating what they learned. They're working together to further better themselves. But at some certain point, group members are going to start saying, geez, you know, I'd rather be doing something else with my Wednesday night. Or some group members go, why are we going over this again? And you start to see the maturation of the group start to slip near this period. The difficult part of facilitating these groups is sometimes facilitators wait too long to recognize that the group's maturation is starting to be reduced. And then what ends up happening usually is you end up having a lot of dropouts. You start losing members. Members stop listening. And so it's important to identify when it's time to adjourn a group. When is it time to say, okay, we are where we're at, and we've gotten to a point where you all are taking on the skills and everything else. And then you go through a adjourning phase, which usually is something ceremonial, or certificates are handed out, families are invited. I know when I did a father's group, we ended the group with a barbecue where the family was invited, and they each cooked a meal for their family. And I'll tell you, in some of those, it was the very first time that the father actually had the opportunity. And I wouldn't say opportunity, they probably had the opportunity to do it, but it's the first time that they created a meal and was kind of in the service of their family, in the service of their children. Um, and so that kind of was a meaningful moment for those men. And so that's just an example of an adjourning type thing. Okay. Let's see where we're at. What I want to talk about kind of in the last few minutes we have together is group cohesiveness. When do you know that your group is I don't know if this is a proper term, a tight-knit members who appreciate each other's perspectives, and the group wants to grow and develop together. That's kind of a way I would define cohesiveness in treatment type groups. Okay. As this suggests, it's the loyalty by group members. So there's a couple ways you can see whether or not you have good group cohesiveness. One is the level of participation increases. Um, so participants help get members actively involved, but too much can be a waste of time, and I'll get to that in a minute. So you know you're getting good group cohesiveness when the group members, not the facilitators, encourage other group members to participate. What you have to do, and I think this is probably not the best term for this, is when the group starts to try and get one individual or two individuals in the group to open up, and they spend a lot of time. As a facilitator, that's when you want to kind of intervene and get the group moving along, because that resistance of those other group members may be a maturity thing. It may be a psychosocial thing that they have. Maybe they have group anxiety or shyness issues. It may be that they haven't felt like they're a good member for the group. They're still kind of judging whether they should be there or not. And that pressuring by other group members sometimes can lead to that group member leaving. So when we talk about actively involved, it's that the group encourages others to talk. Okay. Level of conformity, as conformity rises, so does cohesiveness. Again, there can be too much conformity because everyone could just start saying what the next person said. And, we get this all the time. If you've ever noticed, when you do introductions in a class, you can start with the first person and they'll say, oh, yes, I'm in this class because I want to learn about blah, blah, blah. But somewhere around the third or fourth one, you start hearing, I'm in this class because it's a prerequisite for my degree. And then it follows along with the rest of the group members. So that's when conformity is too high. Um, but when we're talking about conformity in the group setting, this is when everyone, remember in that norming phase, everyone is starting to follow the rules of the group. Everyone is accepting, let's do thinking check-ins, let's do the educational part of the group if that's the case, and then let's do our checkouts. And that's kind of, and they follow that kind of pattern of everyone conforming to the group expectations. And then a level of group goal accomplishment. And this is kind of probably one that the facilitator is, as a facilitator, you're kind of going, no, duh. You want everybody to be accomplishing and working through the group. Okay. But when you start seeing clients who start using healthy coping behaviors, so when you start seeing Charlie start to implement coping behaviors to deal with substance use triggers. So, and it brings them up. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not, but they're still using what they're learning in the group and applying it to their lived experience outside the group. This is when you know that you're having good group cohesiveness occur. And then there's what we call determinants of cohesiveness, can be altered or changed cohesiveness level. So this can change the cohesiveness of a group. So group size, of course, that allows for very high cohesiveness. But again, you want to keep that group around 6 to 9 groups. After that, you kind of want to split them up. I will tell you, probably one of the worst groups I facilitated, and it was a huge mistake on my and organization side, is when I used to do domestic violence survivor groups. They got really, really popular, and another group facilitator quit. And so they just combined two groups. And at that time, I had 12, that person had 9. So now we were facilitating a group, 26 or so, or no, something like that, 25, 26 things. And it just did not go well. It ruined the cohesiveness I built with my group. And I saw a lot of division in the other group. And then there started kind of some infighting. And so that's something to look for. And this can happen really rapidly with what are called open-ended group, meaning someone can come into the group at any time the group process is going on, and that can really change the dynamics of your group. So you want to keep an eye on that. Manage diversity. Diverse groups often come up with better solutions. So making sure you have a good mix of and different experiences within the group. Group identity. We're going to spend at least one class talking about identity and group identity, because there's two things. There's a positive end to developing a good, strong group identity, and that is the support they give each other. It increases liking of other members. It does a lot of positive things. On the negative end of it, it starts to become a component of their identity. Okay. So a lot of you'll probably AA does a really good job of developing a very strong group identity. And you'll notice that members that are really, really committed to AA, it comes up in every conversation in their life. It has become such a part of their identity that they go to dinner with their family and they mention, this is what I'm, and it's a major focus of who they are. And they also tend to get upset when others criticize that type of group or criticize AA or something like that. So that's something that we'll spend a little bit of time on, a class or two, about how you can use the positive aspects of group identity to move the group along, but how you want to be careful about it becoming an embedded part of the individual's identity. That's where you want to be more careful. Success, cohesiveness increases with success. So, a lot of facilitators, once they get the check-in going, they'll say something like, uh, tell us a challenge you had the last week, and then also tell us something positive that happened the next week, so that they start to recognize that their happiness and everything is an important component of their life and is a success to the group. So just to summarize this, and then we'll call it good, because I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, is again, what are the things that are going to influence common cohesiveness? Of course, the development of common goals in the norming phase, and the storming phase, recognition of success experiences, making sure that the group stays at a manageable level. I'm going to come back to here to conclude our class here in a minute. External threats. So, one threat to a common group is, for example, in the substance abuse field, the drug culture and those people coming into that individual's life and saying things like, "Oh, what you're learning in that group is bullshit. You don't need to go to that. There's no reason for you." And so when we talk about external threats, we're talking about individuals outside of the group, family, friends, even sometimes colleagues, who have a negative view about what the individual is going through, and saying things like therapy is just crap, it doesn't work, and those kinds of things. Um, High status. So whenever you can elevate the level of your group, and this is not necessarily something, in therapy groups and stuff like this, but this is saying, you guys are in one of the most effective types of treatments for this right now, making them feel like they're a part of a special group that is going through this experience that's going to make them successful. And then, of course, by the end of the norming phase, we want people to be cooperating with each other, and the like. I'm going to end with just a comment about interpersonal attraction, okay? Because this can both have a negative effect and a positive effect on cohesion. But I'm going to go to an example using children and studies we've done about attractive children versus less attractive children. So we're going to set up a study where we work with teachers who say they treat all of their students the same. They have no biases about their students. Each student gets equal attention, and equal feedback. Okay. So what do we do as psychologists? We go in and measure that, right? And regardless of how egalitarian or equal the teacher is, they tend to give less attractive students more negative attention, more negative feedback. They tend to be more punitive. They tend to use more physical types of discipline, such as going and putting them in timeout. They give them less positive attention and less attention overall, where they give the attractive children more positive feedback, more positive attention, and more awards, even if those awards weren't earned at a greater rate than what the less attractive children are receiving. What's the point of bringing up that study is that we may think as facilitators that we have an unbiased mind, that attractiveness, the gender of our participants, and all those things don't matter. But I guarantee you they do. And I've even seen this in group settings where there's either a very attractive male or a very attractive female in the group, and that facilitator almost fixates on that individual. But then when the supervisor goes in and says, "Do you notice this?" The facilitator goes, "No, no, I gave all my group members attention." And then we have them watch the recording. And it's interesting to see, uh, excuse me, the recording. You'll also notice this with the group members, that the group members tend to give the more attractive people in a group more attention than the less attractive individuals in the room. Okay. Why I'm bringing this up, because this is one of those biases that before you enter the group room, I want you to take out of your head, set it outside the door, and just be very consciously aware that you can create this environment that some people are not being heard. Other people are being heard more just by their physical appearance. Okay. The other reason why I want to bring this up, and this is an important thing to do, especially when you have mixed gendered groups, is that you can get, because of the group identity that is being developed, you can start to see the formation of intimate relationships between individuals. And again, as a facilitator, we'll try and get to some of these skills. You really will want to kind of almost interrupt that from occurring. And I know a lot of times it's not humanly possible, but we should do all we can. And the reason being is I've seen, unfortunately, where, for example, a male becomes attracted to another female because they have they're basically, understanding each other. They have similar problems and maybe similar experiences with substance abuse, but then they're also physically attracted to them. And I have seen where, the married man will divorce their spouse, and if it's a married female, they'll divorce their spouse, leave their kids, and be together. That's the other reason why you want to be careful about encouraging the development of intimate relationships within the group setting, because I have seen, unfortunately, families torn apart because of it. So that's another thing you want to be aware of as a facilitator. Okay, so I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna stop recording.